Hey guys, as you can see, this is an update episode on the Ellen Greenberg case that we covered last year. And in the last few weeks, there have been so many updates. Things have totally turned on their heads. Lots of things have changed. And so we want to give you an update. We're going to have that at the end. So if you listen through this episode, you'll get to hear all the names again. There's lots of people involved in this story and give you a little refresher. And at the end, we will catch you with the update. And there truly is more going on than I even realized before we decided to do this
There's
update.
so much to update.
Yeah,
yes.
There's so much to say, and please stick with us, and thanks for listening.
The story we have this week is really fascinating. It has some of the most unique and just really upsetting, unsettling circumstances I've ever come across in a crime case, and as Melissa kind of already said, she's already gone on even more, deep dives on this since we recorded the first time. And of course, we're all going to break all of that down in great detail. But just to kind of give you an overview of where we're going in the story this week, in January of 2011, a 27-year-old newly engaged Philadelphia woman named Ellen Ray Greenberg was found dead in the kitchen of her apartment with 20 stab wounds, including a fatal wound to her chest. Strangely, her apartment was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry or any sign of a struggle. Ellen had been dealing with feelings of stress and anxiety in the weeks leading up to her death, so the police quickly ruled it a suicide. But as you can imagine, with 20 stab wounds, her family and many others have had plenty of doubt over that, and they believe that Ellen's case is far from being resolved. This story has been featured on Voices for Justice, and a popular true crime journalist and YouTuber named Gavin Fish, who does a lot of deep dives, has put a lot of effort and time into this case to obtain the court documents. And Haley, our lovely researcher, was able to actually use those documents in her research. So thank you to Gavin, who has done all of that work, and definitely check out his YouTube channel if you love a good deep dive. But there have actually also been some recent developments in the story, and Ellen's parents are passionate about sharing their daughter's case and just everything they've gone through fighting for justice since her death. So we'll just jump right into the story of Ellen Ray Greenberg.
Ellen, who was born on June 23, 1983, was a vibrant and athletic young woman who was raised in New Jersey before her family moved to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Ellen was the only child to parents Josh and Sandy, who both worked in the dental field. Josh was a periodontist and Sandy was a dental hygienist. Ellen was known for her bubbly personality and for being a natural-born leader. She was great at sports and she loved softball and golf, and she was always actively involved in school activities while she was growing up. After finishing high school, Ellen went off to Penn State, where she began majoring in communications, but ultimately she ended up finding her true passion, which was teaching. She transferred to Temple University to pursue a degree in education. Ellen got her first teaching job in a first-grade classroom at Juniata Park Academy in Philadelphia. Those who knew her believed that she was happy in her job, and her parents had no reason to think that Ellen wasn't content with her life. Enter Samuel Goldberg. Samuel was a TV producer who swept Ellen off of her feet, and after a couple of years of dating, they were engaged in the summer of 2010 with plans to get married in August of 2011. The couple lived in a gated luxury apartment complex called Venice Lofts, just outside of Philadelphia. The area was known for being mostly secure, with guards at the gate and cameras monitoring the grounds. However, as the wedding got closer, Ellen's behavior started to change. Her once upbeat, happy-go-lucky personality became more withdrawn and less independent. She started to rely heavily on Sam to make decisions for her, which was not like her at all. Ellen did express that she was feeling overwhelmed at work, and she even questioned if teaching was the right job for her, and she considered leaving. But her colleagues didn't really notice anything beyond the typical stresses of the job. There was one instance where Ellen sent a text to her parents that said, quote, "I want to leave this place. Get me out," end quote. But it's really not clear what she meant by this place. Ellen also secretly asked her cousin in Philadelphia if she could temporarily move in with them, but when her cousin asked whether Sam would be coming, Ellen didn't respond.
Ellen's parents started to feel that the changes in her mood and her behavior were starting to be concerning enough that she should see a psychiatrist for help. Ellen agreed with them, and she met with a doctor 3 times in January of 2011. During these sessions, Ellen talked about her feelings of being generally overwhelmed, and the doctor prescribed Klonopin for anxiety and Ambien for sleep issues. And these medications did appear to be working for Ellen. She actually told her parents that she was feeling much better. Ellen had an appointment with her psychiatrist scheduled for January 27th, but she would never make it to that appointment. On January 26th, the Philadelphia area was hit with a heavy snowstorm that resulted in school closures, and this included the school that Ellen worked at. So she left work early and stopped to fill up her gas tank on the way home, and then she got back to her apartment. At some point after she got home, she entered grades into the system for her students. But exactly what happened next still remains a mystery to this day. According to Ellen's fiancé, Sam, the couple hung out together until about 4:45 that afternoon, and at that time, he decided to go down to the apartment complex gym. Sam said he came back about 30 to 45 minutes later, and he noticed that the door to the apartment was locked from the inside with the security swing bar. Since he couldn't get inside, he tried banging on the door to get Ellen's attention, but he still got no answer from her. So he started sending her these frantic text messages, and they were really increasing in frustration for about the next hour. He was texting things like, "Hello, open the door. What are you doing? I'm getting pissed. You better have an excuse, and you have no idea." After another half hour or so went by, Sam went down to the apartment security desk to see if there was a guard who might be able to help him break into the apartment. They went back, and with the guard present, Sam forced open the door. Inside the apartment, Ellen was found lying on the kitchen floor covered in blood, and there was a 10-inch knife sticking out of her chest. Sam immediately dialed 911 and told the dispatcher that the door had been locked from the inside and that Ellen was dead and there was blood everywhere. He was asked to start CPR, and at first he hesitated and asked the dispatcher if he had to, and he then agreed to try, and he was instructed to remove Ellen's sweatshirt and start CPR, and that's when Sam said he noticed a 10-inch knife sticking out of Ellen's heart. After hanging up with 911, Sam called his own parents, who then called Ellen's parents, and unfortunately, they were snowbound. As I mentioned, there was a bad snowstorm, so they were just outside of Philadelphia, and they were unable to travel to the scene.
When paramedics arrived, they found Ellen slumped on the kitchen floor with her back against the lower cabinets and her legs extended in front of her. There was a perfectly white towel in her left hand. She had blood on her face, her right hand, which was actually closed in a loose fist, as well as her boots and her clothing. All of the blood was confined to the immediate area around her body, suggesting that she had not moved from that spot during or after she was stabbed. There was some blood on the cabinets behind her and 2 drops on the granite countertop above her. A 10-inch serrated Cutco knife was lodged in the left side of her chest through her clothing. Ellen's glasses were on the floor nearby, and there was a collection of dark-colored hair found between her legs. They noticed that it looked like Ellen was in the middle of making a fruit salad. There was a strainer on the counter with oranges and blueberries in it that looked halfway prepared. On the counter, there was a knife block that had been knocked over on its side, and there were 2 clean knives in the sink that looked to have fallen out when the knife block was turned over. And these knives from this knife block were consistent with the knife found in Ellen's chest. So for obvious reasons, this scene raises numerous questions. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and nothing appeared to have been stolen from the apartment. Numerous valuables were found left untouched, including 3 laptops. Furthermore, the snow outside on the patio was undisturbed, which ruled out the possibility that someone entered or escaped through the patio, which was actually 6 stories high and would be really the only way you could escape with the front door locked from the inside. Ellen had numerous stab wounds, but most were superficial except for the fatal stab wound to her chest. Despite all of these suspicious details, police quickly ruled Ellen's death a suicide, mostly because of the fact that the apartment was locked from the inside and there were really no other signs of foul play. There really wasn't even a big investigation into what actually happened to Ellen as a result. Only a limited number of photos were taken of the scene, and the only items taken into evidence were Ellen's medications and a booklet she'd been keeping. They didn't bag the knife that was in Ellen's chest, but instead removed it during her autopsy. The apartment itself was never treated as a crime scene, which has led to a nightmare for Ellen's family and a labyrinth of unanswered questions.
Sam was taken to the police station to be interviewed, but the details of that initial interview are still unknown. Neighbors of the couple told officers that they heard Sam banging on the door when he was trying to get back inside the apartment, but they said they didn't hear any other disturbances before that. Ellen's parents were completely stunned to learn that their daughter had been fatally stabbed. They had just talked to her that morning, and her mom said they had a perfectly normal conversation, and Ellen showed no sign that she was in distress. Her parents were aware of her struggles with anxiety, but Ellen had never shown signs that she was having suicidal thoughts. In fact, Ellen was actually very squeamish when it came to pain, and she couldn't even handle getting a second ear piercing, so her parents just couldn't fathom that she would do something as gruesome as stabbing herself multiple times. But at the same time, Ellen's parents also didn't have any qualms about her relationship with Sam either. They really liked him and described him as being a fine young man who they were excited to welcome into the family as their new son-in-law. They said there was no hint of any verbal or physical abuse within their relationship. Ellen's psychiatrist was also interviewed and confirmed that Ellen had been feeling overwhelmed with work and that she had recently been prescribed Klonopin and Ambien, but even the psychiatrist said Ellen only ever spoke positively about Sam during their sessions, and she never said anything to her psychiatrist that would indicate that she was having suicidal thoughts. In fact, on January 17th, the psychiatrist wrote in their notes that Ellen wasn't suicidal. And then during another session that was just 2 days later, the psychiatrist wrote that Ellen was, quote, way better. An autopsy was performed the day after Ellen's death, and the results painted a really disturbing picture. Dr. Marlon Osborne counted 20 stab wounds, including 10 on the back of Ellen's neck, with one that penetrated her brain. This wound in particular had the potential to have affected her ability to move. Another wound was found near her spinal cord that would have been enough to incapacitate her. A 10-inch knife was still embedded 4 inches into Ellen's chest. She had one wound to her abdomen that was 2 inches deep, and the other wounds ranged in size and depth, but the majority of the stab wounds were not merely superficial like the authorities first believed. There were also 11 bruises found on Ellen's body in various stages of healing, but there was no further investigation into the source of these bruises. The only substances they found in the toxicology screen were the prescribed medications Klonopin and Ambien, and they did make a note that both of those do have the potential side effect for suicidal thoughts. Dr. Osborne was told by police before the autopsy that they, the police, had ruled her death a suicide, and they told the doctor about how Sam claimed to have broken down the door and found Ellen on the floor. So initially, the medical examiner actually disagreed with the authorities and concluded that Ellen's death was not a suicide, but was actually a homicide. But the Philadelphia Police Department urged him to reconsider and change the manner of death to pending while they continued their investigation. Hours after the Philadelphia Police Department had found out about the medical examiner's findings, the media reported that the police did not consider Ellen's case a homicide, but behind the scenes, they actually did transfer the case to the homicide department. And boy, do we have so much more to get into with this story after a quick break to hear a word from this week's sponsors.
So before the break, police have found Ellen Greenberg. They've gone through her apartment, but really off the bat, they believe that this was a suicide due to the door being closed and locked from the inside. But Ellen's family is really not agreeing with this. There's a lot to them that looks like something else may have happened. So investigators returned to Ellen's apartment to do a more thorough search, but this led to no significant findings. The apartment had already been cleaned, so there was no significant forensic evidence left, but they did collect Ellen's engagement ring into evidence, which was actually the only thing that they took. They also checked Sam's key fob data and reviewed the security cameras at the complex to verify his story. The key fob, which was likely used to enter the gym, possibly to re-enter the apartment building, did actually corroborate Sam's story and his timeline, and the security cameras showed no evidence that anyone suspicious could have entered the apartment. However, there weren't any cameras in Ellen's hallway. On January 29th, police obtained Ellen's cell phone and both her work and personal laptops, as well as Sam's laptop. There was no evidence that Ellen had been looking up anything about suicide or considering ending her life, but police clung to this notion that their investigation was leading them towards this being a suicide. But still, the medical examiner stood firm in his belief that Ellen was murdered. Because of this stark difference of opinion, it was suggested that they bring in an independent neuropathologist to determine if the injuries to her neck would have paralyzed Ellen. And of course, this is important to know because if it did, she wouldn't have been able to deliver the final stab wound to her chest. According to authorities, this expert, Dr. Rourke Adams, found that Ellen's spinal cord sheath had been damaged, but the actual spinal cord was intact. This could have led to Ellen's body going numb, which police claim would have allowed her to continue stabbing herself without pain. Therefore, in their opinion, suicide was still a possibility.
On February 18th, the police formally declared that Ellen's death was a suicide and said they couldn't prove anything else and were just letting things go where they went. At this point, though, the medical examiner still hadn't changed his findings, but that would soon change. On April 4th, Dr. Osborne had a change of heart. He noted Ellen's history of anxiety and the fact that Sam returned to find the apartment locked from the inside and had to break in. And Dr. Osborne also said at this time that the injury to Ellen's spinal cord would not have incapacitated her, which he said he was basing on Dr. Rourke Adams's findings. So furthermore, he noted that the DNA on the knife and on Ellen's clothing were only a match to herself. Dr. Osborne noted in his final report that he had not been given any summary of a detailed interrogation of Sam. Ellen's parents weren't even notified about this change to their daughter's death certificate. They found out that the medical examiner officially changed their daughter's death to a suicide when they heard about it in the media, which just is one of many infuriating things that happen in this story over and over again. But just absolutely, I can't imagine them not notifying her family that they were making this huge change.
Huge.
And of course, Ellen's parents, Josh and Sandy, were far from being convinced that Ellen had taken her own life. So they took matters into their own hands and started their own investigation by requesting copies of Ellen's autopsy records and photos, as well as the crime scene photos and Dr. Osborne's report on the crime scene. No parent or anyone, you should never have to be in a position where you feel that you need to request photos of your loved one's crime scene or autopsy. You should have full faith that the authorities are the ones that are going to look at that and they're going to come to the correct conclusions and that the right path is going to be followed. The fact that they even felt that they had to ask for those things just makes me so sad.
I know.
Ellen's parents also talked to some of her friends, and they did find out some kind of perplexing new information. One of Ellen's friends told them that she was actually planning to leave her life in Philadelphia and move back in with her parents on the day that she died.
The Greenbergs sent all the evidence they gathered to a forensic pathologist in Pittsburgh named Dr. Wecht. He was actually the guy who became famous for challenging the single bullet theory in the JFK assassination. Dr. Wecht reviewed the materials and came to the conclusion that Ellen's death was a homicide, not a suicide. In his report, which he released on January 12, 2012, he highlighted a number of critical points. First and foremost, Ellen's friends, family, and even her psychiatrist said they never saw any signs that she was suicidal, and Ellen didn't leave a note indicating that she took her life either. In fact, on the contrary, she acted totally normal and had normal conversations with her loved ones that same day. Dr. Wecht also pointed out that suicide by stabbing is incredibly rare, especially when there are multiple wounds involved. Truly, I cannot think of a worse way to end your own life. I mean, that is just completely violent.
It seems like an unusual choice for anyone, really.
For anyone, but especially someone we know is squeamish. Already, it doesn't make any sense. Ellen had multiple deep stab wounds, including ones on her back, which is highly suspicious and suggested that another person was involved. Furthermore, Ellen was stabbed through her clothing, which isn't typical of someone who is stabbing themselves. These findings were supported by another professional, Gregory McDonald, who was the dean of the School of Health Services at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, and he was also a deputy coroner. McDonald took a look at the case and agreed that the nature of Ellen's wounds did not align with the suicide theory and that her injuries were more indicative of a homicide. With the evidence mounting that Ellen was murdered, the Greenbergs hired civil rights lawyer Larry Krasner. Larry has a reputation for being able to talk to police and swing things in favor of his clients. In May of 2012, Larry met with police officials and representatives from the DA's office, but despite their efforts, investigators did not reopen the case.
Around the same time, the Greenbergs also enlisted the help of former State Attorney General Walter Cohen, who agreed to represent the family pro bono. He filed requests to obtain public records and police notes, but these requests were denied. And when he persisted, the authorities did finally allow the Greenbergs to look at the notes, but they weren't allowed to make any copies or really do anything with them. And they later said they weren't even sure what they were looking for, which obviously makes sense. Police files are massive. There's so much information.
Right.
If you don't know exactly what you're looking for and you're not allowed to take copies and you have to figure it out right that moment while I assume, officers standing over you,
100%.
what are you supposed to do with that? The regular person that's not gonna be helpful to anyone.
No.
So as the search for answers continued, the Greenbergs met a new ally in Tom Brennan, who was a former chief of detectives with 25 years of experience, and he offered to examine the evidence and just give a fresh perspective at no cost. He said that the absence of defensive wounds didn't necessarily rule out homicide, because Ellen could have easily been the victim of a sudden, overwhelming assault that didn't leave her any time to defend herself before she was incapacitated. Interestingly, Brennan also noticed something else in the crime scene photos, and it was a trickle of blood on Ellen's left cheek that ran horizontally from her nose to her ear. And that didn't make any sense given the position that her body was in, which was sitting and slumped over. The pattern on her face defied gravity, and that opened the door to even further questions. Tom Brennan also did a little digging into the locked door of Ellen's apartment. And this detail is, what suggested that Ellen had been home alone at the time of her death. But Brennan was able to easily go on the good old internet and find videos showing how easy it was to actually manipulate a swing lock from the outside. So that means if he could find it on, I assume, YouTube or something similar, anyone could find that. Anybody could have locked the swing lock after they left the apartment. Tom Brennan then held a conference call with Dr. Osborne, who's the doctor that did Ellen's autopsy and eventually changed the manner of death from homicide to suicide after the police pressured him to do so. He got on a call with him and another medical examiner named Dr. Samuel Galino. And he asked them why the manner of death in Ellen's case was changed. And Dr. Osborne told him the police insisted he change it due to the absence of defensive wounds. When Brennan pressed him about why exactly he was letting the police influence his medical determination, Dr. Osborne refused to answer that question, and the call was quickly ended. But still, the official ruling that Ellen's death was a suicide remained unchanged, and the Greenbergs were still left without answers to their most critical questions.
In the pursuit of justice for Ellen, her parents brought in more experts to scrutinize the evidence. One of these experts was Detective Scott Eelman, who specialized in crime scene reconstruction and evidence processing. Scott found multiple crucial issues within the evidence. One of the most telling signs, in his opinion, was the way the security latch on the apartment door was damaged, and I thought this was fascinating as well, Mandy. The door side of the latch was visibly damaged, but the screws were still intact in their holes. And on the door jamb side of the latch, there were no signs of damage at all. So he also noticed there was no debris on the floor around the door, which there would have been if Sam had broken it down to get inside.
Which, I've never broken down a door, but I've seen enough police TV shows where they show pictures of a breaking and entering to know that it's messy. It's not something that's just going to be we just bent this one little thing. When you break someone's door down, it makes a mess.
Right.
It's not something, it's pretty obvious what happened there. Yeah.
Absolutely. He also noticed that there was no debris on the floor around the door, which, again, there would have been if Sam had broken it down to get inside. And so all of this would suggest that the door was not as forcibly opened as Sam made it out to be. Eelman was also suspicious about the blood patterns on Ellen's body, particularly that spot on her face that the other experts had pointed out. But he also noticed a bloodstain on the floor between Ellen's right hand and her glasses. The stain had a hard edge, which meant that something prevented the natural flow of blood or that the stain had been altered. There was also a distinct pattern within the bloodstain that could have come from footwear or something else, but likely meant that Ellen was not in the position she was found in for all the stabbings.
At some point, a former homicide investigator turned PI named Guy DeAndre took up the case and came to many of the same conclusions as the other experts. But he noticed that there was also something pretty big missing, and that was the neuropathology report on Ellen's spinal cord. So this was the report that was ordered to resolve that disagreement between Dr. Osborne and the police over whether Ellen would even have the ability to stab herself if she had a damaged spinal cord. DeAndre could only find reference to the statement that was made by Dr. Rourke Adams when she said that Ellen could have still moved, but the actual report was nowhere to be found in the case files. When the PI requested this report from the police and the medical examiner's office, he was told they couldn't find it and that it might not even exist because there wasn't even an invoice for the service in the system. I can't imagine how absolutely infuriating that would be to hear that.
Oh, absolutely. And every step of this, it's like you should not have to fight this hard to get answers for what happened to your child.
Yeah, never. So unwilling to give up until he got to the bottom of this PI, Guy DeAndre, contacted Dr. Rourke Adams directly, and she confirmed in an email that she did do contract work for the medical examiner's office back in 2011, but said that she did not have any reports on Ellen's case and concluded that she must not have seen Ellen's spinal cord. If she did, there would be a report on it. She said there was a remote possibility that it was shown to her, but she didn't have any recollection of the case, which also seems kind of like, to me, seems like a case you would remember. Someone being stabbed 20 times and it being ruled as suicide seems like one of those cases that would stand out. I'm not saying that she didn't remember the case. I'm just saying if it were me, I feel like I would have remembered this case.
Yeah.
But this was actually a really big deal because Dr. Rourke Adams's involvement, or I guess her lack of involvement now, is a crucial part of the case since it was her supposed conclusion that supported Dr. Osborne's finding of suicide. So without the explanation for how it was possible for Ellen to continue stabbing herself after a spinal cord injury, they ultimately wouldn't have been able to determine that her death was a suicide because it would have proven that it was impossible. So the fact that this report is missing is such a big piece of this case.
Seriously.
DeAndre concluded that for every piece of evidence that the police say pointed to suicide, any other reasonable person could look at even that same evidence and believe that it was a homicide. Ellen's parents continued hiring experts, and all of the experts continued to come to the same conclusion that Ellen was most likely murdered. Dr. Wayne K. Ross, who's a specialist in forensic and neuropathology, concluded that the stab wound that penetrated Ellen's cranial cavity had severed critical nerves in her brain, and that would have resulted in severe pain, cranial nerve dysfunction, traumatic brain signs, and symptoms that would include numbness, tingling, irregular heartbeat, respiratory depression, neurogenic shock, and impaired or loss of consciousness. He said there was also significant evidence even to suggest that there was more than one weapon used in Ellen's death, even though they only found the one there. He said that there was a strong likelihood that both a serrated knife, which is the type they found still lodged in her body, and a smooth edge knife were both used in the attack. Also, Ellen's body had several bruises consistent with a pattern of repeated beating, as well as evidence of strangulation. And that actually is verified in the autopsy report. The autopsy report has photos and notes about hemorrhaging on the inside of Ellen's throat.
So she also beat herself and strangled herself. Right. And then stabbed herself. Got it. So the Greenbergs also hired the infamous Dr. Henry Lee. He agreed with most of the experts before him, but he also made a few notes of his own. Dr. Lee noted that the blood on Ellen's face was flowing in different directions, which could indicate that she was moved. Other blood evidence suggested that Ellen was standing when she received some of the wounds and then fell to the floor where the stabbings continued. Lee also noted that the location of several wounds were in places that would be difficult for someone to inflict on themselves. He concluded that the number and the type of wounds, as well as the bloodstain patterns, were consistent with a homicide. In addition to all these findings, the attorney for the Greenbergs also pointed out a few other things unrelated to the crime scene that really didn't line up with the suicide theory either. After Ellen left work that day due to the snowstorm, she filled her tank up with gas. When she got home, she entered her grades for the students, and when she was stabbed, she was literally in the middle of preparing a fruit salad, which was left unfinished on the counter. The attorney also said there were details of the crime scene itself that made no sense, including that knife block in the kitchen that was found laying on its side with two of the knives knocked into the sink. This was more consistent with someone frantically and quickly grabbing for a knife in the midst of an altercation. In 2017, one of the attorneys working with the family, Larry Krasner, was elected DA of Philadelphia. So the Greenbergs asked him to reopen Ellen's case, but of course, it's a conflict of interest at this point, and Larry Krasner referred the request to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. The investigation then went stagnant for a while, and that is until 2019, when Stephanie Farr wrote an article for the Philadelphia Inquirer regarding Ellen's case and all of the inconsistencies found by several different experts. As part of her work on the article, Stephanie reached out to the Attorney General's office, which sparked a renewed interest in the case. The Attorney General's office responded stating that they had thoroughly investigated Ellen's death in 2018 when they received the case. There were details about Ellen's personal computer and phone in the files that showed where Ellen had searched things online related to suicide, including the terms painless suicide and quick death. Further, they believe some texts sent to her mom also suggested Ellen was in mental distress. But really, basically, they're saying they agree with the official ruling that Ellen took her own life, which we still cannot believe.
So frustrating.
Absolutely. And there's still more to get into after one last break to hear a word from this week's sponsors.
Just before the last break, we were talking about 2019. The Attorney General's office was looking into the case and ultimately came back and said they already reviewed the case and agreed with the authorities before them that this was a suicide. Ellen's parents, of course, still weren't convinced, and in their opinion, the computer searches that the Attorney General's office say they found, including searches for painless suicide, weren't in line with the violent death that Ellen suffered. Stephanie Farr, who's the journalist that was working on the story, pressed the Attorney General's office about why they didn't include this crucial information in the original 2011 investigation, and they admitted that they couldn't find the analysis in the file they had, and they only had just obtained it from the Regional Computer Forensics Lab in 2018, many years later. Ellen's parents still weren't giving up. In June of 2019, one of their attorneys wrote a letter to the chief medical examiner, Dr. Sam Galino, urging him to reconsider the official cause of death due to these very serious doubts raised by multiple experts that all believed Ellen was murdered. They just wanted the case to be re-examined, but Dr. Galino and Dr. Osborne, who is the one that did Ellen's autopsy, still refused to change the cause of death, and they also refused to reopen the investigation. The Greenbergs' next move was to get the help of clinical neuropsychologist Dr. Louis Lazarus. Dr. Lazarus was able to use advanced computer modeling to make a 3D reconstruction of Ellen's injuries based on what was in the autopsy findings. This analysis showed it would have been nearly impossible for Ellen to inflict 11 out of the 20 stab wounds on herself. The trajectory of the wounds and the severity of her injuries would have caused significant impairment or unconsciousness. Dr. Lazarus also highlighted how improbable the suicide theory was and questioned the validity of those internet searches regarding suicide. He pointed out, there's no way to prove that Ellen even made those searches to begin with. In his final report, Dr. Lazarus concluded that Ellen did not and couldn't possibly have taken her own life. Sadly, even with all the mounting evidence and the support of countless professionals, the Greenbergs were at an impasse. The authorities just wouldn't budge in their official stance, and they were left without a lot of other options. So, in October of 2019, Ellen's parents finally filed a lawsuit against Dr. Osborne and the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office.
So the goal of this lawsuit was to finally get answers in Ellen's case and ultimately have the manner of death changed to reflect what the evidence actually showed. They wanted Ellen's murder to be investigated as such. Her dad said, quote, "We have no family future without our daughter. Every family's future is with their children. There is none in our life," end quote. The judge later said that the civil suit should go to trial because the fact that Dr. Osborne relied on information from the police rather than independently confirming it raised legitimate questions about whether or not he abused his discretion in Ellen's case. The Greenbergs were granted a non-jury trial to get the cause of death changed to either undecided or homicide. The medical examiner's office appealed the lawsuit, which we'll go into more detail about shortly. So after they sued the medical examiner's office, Ellen's family was able to get more in depth with their investigation. and they learned for the first time that there were many omissions and discrepancies in the investigation, as well as alleged misconduct by people in the DA's office and the medical examiner's office. This blew my mind, and I cannot stop thinking about it, but they found out that the security guard that was working on the day Ellen was found dead did not actually go with Sam to the apartment and watch him break down the door, which
Oh
is
my gosh.
what everyone was told from the beginning. The guard actually gives a sworn statement saying that he never saw Sam do anything on the 6th floor. He never went into the apartment, and he never saw Ellen's body. So this whole witness they have to Sam breaking in the door and all of this,
Not even
witnessed
true.
nothing.
Yep, not even
Nope.
true.
And so, of course, this is huge and also a direct contradiction to what Sam told the police. So Ellen's parents got footage from the building's camera in the lobby and confirmed that what the guard said was true. Neither he nor anyone else went with Sam to the apartment prior to the arrival of emergency services. At one point during these proceedings, Dr. Osborne gave a deposition where he said that police had point blank asked him to change Ellen's manner of death from homicide to suicide very early in the investigation. He said he refused to do so for a while, but after authorities kept pressuring him about it, he complied with their request. Apparently, he was called into a special meeting with high-ranking officials who showed him evidence that they felt pointed towards suicide, including the lack of defensive wounds and the door being locked from the inside. And they said that a security guard watched Sam break down the door, which, again, we just said is not true at all. So Dr. Osborne admitted that he did not independently investigate any of this information about the crime scene, nor did he reenact the wounds or examine their angles or take measurements of Ellen's arms and fingers to see if it was even possible, physically possible, for her to have done this to herself. He said on the stand that it would have been incorrect for him to make a suicide ruling if it could in fact be established that one or more of Ellen's wounds could not have been self-inflicted. He also said that if he had known there was any question over whether the security guard witnessed Sam entering the apartment, he wouldn't have amended the death certificate, but he was acting on what police had told him. So after this meeting, Dr. Osborne changes the manner of death to suicide, and then, of course, that's when the Greenbergs find out in the media that the manner of death has been changed.
Wow. So 1 month after Dr. Osborne's deposition, another medical examiner named Dr. Emery gave a deposition as well. But interestingly, everything this medical examiner said was completely new information to what the Greenbergs and their attorneys had really ever heard. Dr. Emery testified that in 2019, Dr. Galino, who was the chief medical examiner, asked her to look over Ellen's spinal cord injury due to these doubts that Dr. Osborne had actually consulted with Dr. Rourke Adams because, as we mentioned before, they couldn't find any report or even an invoice that a report was ordered. So now they're trying to get to the bottom of that. So in a shocking turn of events, Dr. Emery noted there was no hemorrhaging to the spinal cord, which would mean that the injury was inflicted after Ellen was already dead.
Tell me how she did that to herself.
Right.
As a ghost?
So Dr. Emery said she was told by Dr. Galino not to make a written report, so instead she just verbally told him about her findings. Despite having this information, though, Dr. Galino and Dr. Osborne still did not change Ellen's manner of death. And of course, now we have no written report because he has said don't write a report. So now it's your word against mine. And
wow,
there's no report, no paper trail to any of this stuff. And then it also makes me question, was Dr. Rourke Adams also told not to make a written report? Like,
right.
Is that what happened here? You know, that's the reason that doesn't exist. It's just more questions. So now that the Greenbergs had even more evidence and proof their daughter was brutally killed, they asked Dr. Wayne Ross to look over the evidence once again. He's already looked at it before. Now they have more, and he has agreed to look at it once again. He re-examined the spinal cord specimen and concluded that, in his opinion, beyond a doubt, it was simply impossible for Ellen to have inflicted all 20 of the stab wounds on herself. He noted dozens of reasons why Ellen's death was most likely a murder, many of which are the ones that we've already discussed that the other experts have found. A few months after Dr. Ross completed his investigation, Dr. Galino resigned as chief medical examiner. He was interviewed by Philadelphia officers about Ellen's case and said he didn't specifically remember Dr. Emery telling him that the spinal cord injury happened after Ellen's death, but he said that her conclusion did mean Ellen's manner of death should be changed to homicide. Unfortunately, should and did are two different things because it still wasn't changed. The civil trial against the medical examiner's office and Dr. Osborne continued to move forward. The Greenberg's attorney hoped that the attorney general would reopen the investigation based on all this new evidence they'd gathered. So they sent everything they had to them. And the attorney general's office did review the case again, unfortunately still coming to the same determination as before, that Ellen died by suicide. They said, and what I honestly feel is so offensive, they said that her death is an unimaginable tragedy that might be hard to accept, but, quote, all the evidence shows this was a suicide, which is like the craziest gaslighting I've ever heard of, because literally no evidence so far has shown that this looks like a suicide.
None at all. I don't know how you even write that sentence, but to call it an unimaginable tragedy, like to placate the family, is super offensive.
Super offensive. So they also said that the only one who even had the authority to change the cause of death was the medical examiner. So basically they're saying, like, yeah, this is, sorry this happened, but like this isn't even our problem. Like, why are you bothering us with this? Go cry to the medical examiner. That's basically what I'm getting from. That's how I would feel if I was the family. I would be like, what do you mean? Like, you can't do anything? This is beyond ridiculous. In July of 2022, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office announced they would no longer be reviewing Ellen's case due to an appearance of a conflict of interest. They wished the Greenbergs well and referred the case to Chester County, which is a neighboring county. And Chester County said they would have an investigator and a prosecutor of their own review the case. And as far as we can tell, that investigation still is ongoing.
In October of 2022, the Greenbergs took a bold step in their long battle for justice and filed a lawsuit against the city of Philadelphia, alleging that the city had conspired to cover up the murder of their daughter. This lawsuit was built on years of painstaking investigation that had led to the Greenbergs uncovering numerous disturbing details about how Ellen's case was handled right from the start. They alleged that officials suppressed key pieces of physical evidence and that Ellen's manner of death was deliberately changed from homicide to suicide. As a result, there was no investigation into Ellen's likely murder. They also said that authorities gave them false information and cherry-picked evidence to support the suicide ruling while ignoring protocols in place for homicide investigations. One piece of evidence focused on a video that was taken by the apartment manager of Ellen's building, who had allegedly gone into the apartment before anyone else was allowed to access it, and recorded a video of each room to document its condition. The manager gave the tape to the police that same day, but when investigators for the Greenbergs asked for a copy, they were told that tape doesn't exist. This lawsuit also discussed Sam's actions on the day Ellen died. He called several people, including his parents, his uncle, who was a criminal defense attorney, and his cousin, who was also an attorney, and all of these people showed up at the apartment before Ellen's body had even been removed. In the early hours of January 27th, before Ellen's autopsy was done, Sam's attorney uncle and his son contacted the apartment's property manager and asked if they could get into the apartment. The manager wasn't sure if it was allowed, so they actually called the police to ask. The police said it was fine, and they even suggested hiring a crime scene cleanup service, which the family quickly arranged. After the apartment was cleaned and sanitized, Sam's uncle and cousin went back and took several things, including Sam's laptop, both of Ellen's laptops, her work and her personal laptop, and Ellen's personal belongings, like her purse, wallet, keys, and cell phone. Interestingly enough, they left Ellen's engagement ring behind, and that's interesting because it was actually a valuable family heirloom, and that ends up being the only thing police even take.
Right.
Weird.
And why do you need her, purse but not the heirloom of the family? I know it just does not make any sense.
But why do you need her computer? Why don't you leave that for her parents?
And cell phone and things. Mm-hmm. Or the police, who are probably going to want it. It doesn't make any sense why you would take that. It definitely doesn't belong to you, for sure. On January 29th, all the laptops and Ellen's phone were turned over to police, but the authorities never even questioned why Sam's family had these things in their possession to begin with, and never really looked into or questioned whether or not they had been tampered with during the time that they were in possession of other people. When Ellen's laptop was searched by the FBI, they didn't find any evidence to support that she was suicidal. But yet, when the Attorney General's office took over, they claimed to have found this evidence that Ellen looked up suicide-related topics. The city of Philadelphia appealed the Greenbergs' lawsuit, and the case made its way through the courts. The Greenbergs were at the same time pursuing a separate lawsuit against the medical examiner's office in yet another effort to have Ellen's manner of death changed back to homicide. In November 2022, a panel of judges heard arguments in that case. The medical examiner's office argued that what the Greenbergs were asking for was unreasonable and could set a dangerous precedent for allowing families to challenge a medical examiner's findings, which would then open a floodgate of similar lawsuits. I said this on the first recording that we did. I do understand that angle to a degree because, yes, you have to
Sure.
have some kind of, there has to be a boundary. You can't have, in an emotional situation, you can't have everybody coming out and saying they want a redo or a do. You know what I mean? Obviously. However, we know the law is not black and white. Life is not black and white. There's always gray areas. There's always situations that need a second look or that need, a little bit more than the typical. Sometimes you got to bend the rules. That's just how life works. Sometimes there's things that need to be done that might not be typical. I'm not saying everyone needs to have the right to challenge authorities and professionals, but there are clearly times when there's proof that it should be questioned.
Well, for goodness sakes, they can just convince the medical examiner to change the cause of death because they want them to.
Right.
So
why is it
can't
okay for them?
the family do this?
Exactly. Yeah. So the city also said that, in their opinion, the law was clear. They said, quote, "A medical examiner can be wrong as to the manner of death, yet cannot be compelled to change it."
Then why did the police compel him to change it? That makes no sense.
Right. Unfortunately, the appellate court did side with the state and ruled that the Greenbergs had no legal standing to even seek a revision of their daughter's manner of death. This is mind-blowing. The court acknowledged that there were flaws in the original investigation, but said they had no choice but to rule in favor of the medical examiner's office. Okay.
What?
So the decision, of course, this is a major, big blow to the Greenbergs. If they had gotten a ruling that was in their favor, they would have been able to continue to advance the investigation into what actually happened to their daughter. But the court's decision kind of closed the door on all those possibilities. So they were devastated, but still very determined, and appealed the decision to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. As I said, this is so mind-blowing. They're just seeking the right to challenge the official cause of death in Ellen's case. They're not even asking them to change it. Like, they are going to the Supreme Court of the state just to say, like, do we have a right to pursue a lawsuit in this case?
Right.
That's insane.
And all of this takes so much time. So many resources for the family, so many resources for the state. Everyone's paying into this just to ask for the right. This is ridiculous.
Crazy. In early August 2024, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did agree to hear the case. And as I just said, they're not trying to determine the manner of death. They're only trying to decide whether or not Ellen's parents have the legal standing to challenge it. But this is still a glimmer of hope for the family. They're very happy with the decision that the Supreme Court is at least going to hear their case. Joseph Pedraza, who's currently the lawyer for the Greenbergs, talked about the importance of Ellen's case and how the outcome could impact not just Ellen's case, but also set a precedent for other families in similar situations. Not necessarily the type of precedent that the authorities are worried about, but he pointed out that these rulings made by medical examiners do have an impact on survivors' ability to do things like access insurance money and, access victims' funds. Because with a ruling of suicide, a lot of times, especially with insurance, they don't pay those out. And so it does matter. It is a big deal if the police have a case like this and they're trying to say, it affects a lot of things. So Joseph Pedraza is bringing into question, should medical examiners have this absolute discretion that can't be challenged? I would say no, they should not.
Well, apparently you can question them and you can get them to change it, but only if you're the police in Philadelphia.
Exactly. So there hasn't been a date set yet for these Supreme Court arguments, but Melissa, you've already been going and doing more deep diving. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on this story. And when we have any more information or a new update, we'll make sure we share it on the podcast. We've talked about this before in other cases where you're kind of in this terrible merry-go-round with the authorities that you would love to get off of, but you can't.
Sure.
And it just keeps going and going. And like you said, it takes so much time. Everything takes time. All they want to do is have a proper investigation into their daughter's death. It does appear that she was murdered by someone else. I cannot understand why they can't get anyone to look into this and take them seriously. It just makes me so angry for them on their behalf. Truly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for the life of me, I cannot figure. I would want that original Emmy to say, okay, well, now you're looking at all the stab wounds and stuff. Tell me which ones she actually could have done herself, because the second there's one she can't do herself, it's over. She
Right.
couldn't have done that to herself. And I don't know. And I just keep thinking, like, we talked about this on the last recording too, but if you are stabbing, they are always talking about people who come in, the suspect had a cut finger or whatever, because a knife will slip. You're stabbing something. It's going to slip. She doesn't have cuts on her hands.
Right.
You're going to have something. Somebody would have had to have worn gloves, something like that. But none of it makes sense. But I did just see where Brian Enton, he's with News Nation. When Gabby Petito's story was first out, he was like one of the big news guys on that. But he just interviewed the family about a week ago.
Oh, wow.
So you can definitely check that out. And they're talking about the possibility that her body was moved and the evidence that points to that. But it's wild. And this is one of those stories that, like, you may have heard a little bit about, but I had and I knew that the family did not agree, but I just really didn't know that much about the story. But my gosh, if this is what we have, and the family's got more, I cannot imagine. I can't imagine.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the most, there's so much frustrating, but like one of the things I keep coming back to in this is, why is it on, the fact that Ellen's parents have done all this work and hired all these professionals to look into this so that they can prove that their daughter did not complete suicide. Meanwhile, how come the authorities don't have to do any legwork to prove that she did? Like, they're saying, we didn't even conduct any. We didn't measure her arms. We didn't do anything to prove that she could have done this. But yet there's mountains of proof that she did not do this. And that's where I'm hung up on that. I'm like, because why is no one on the other side responsible to prove? Like, if they're saying that she did this herself, then let's see the scientific evidence. Like, we have scientific evidence showing our side that, it doesn't appear that she did. Show us the actual proof that you have that she did. It just is so enraging that they just don't have to provide any proof of that. They can just say, well, that's what we determined. And they don't have to show anything.
No, I don't know. I'll never, this story does not make a lick of sense to me. I mean, it really doesn't. There's just so many things leading up to it that she did normally that day. And not to say that somebody can't change their mind later in the day, but give me a break that you're looking up painless suicide and you are going to stab yourself. That's utterly insane. I just am very raged.
And the way, no one stabs himself in the back, right? That's literally the phrase, like getting stabbed in the back. Like, you don't do that to yourself.
It means another person's doing it.
That's the same thing. Anytime I hear something like that, and then especially multiple stabs to your back, that it's nonsensical. Even if you were planning to take your life that way, you wouldn't stab yourself in the back.
And we always talk about, in these stories, they talk about women, especially with suicide, and how women are women till the end, and they don't want to leave a mess for their family to clean up. And so typically they'll do something like pills or another form of suicide.
And women also don't want to be in pain. They also choose less painful ways of suicide, statistically speaking.
Statistically, yes.
Correct. So,
so it
just doesn't fit.
You just have to show me how on earth somebody could stab themselves in the back several times and get it. I'm so mad.
I know. We're both.
I'm so fired up.
I know about this case. I really am, and definitely will be following this and really hoping that her family is able to get somewhere with her case. I feel,
oh my gosh, get the right
to challenge the authorities.
Not for nothing, but if you're talking to somebody and you find out that the initial story of them trying to get into a locked door and having a witness, and that witness did not do it, I feel like there should be some follow-up in certain areas. And definitely. Why hasn't there been? And I've also looked like I said, I went down some rabbit holes, and there is like a political theory to all of this. So we're not going to get into that.
Okay.
But
I will have to
enjoy the Reddit
though, on my own free time. So, since this episode was released, as we said in the beginning, there have been a lot of updates to Ellen's story. And so, we are going to go over those updates. As Melissa said, there was a ton of updates. So, we'll get right into them. In November of 2024, the Chester County District Attorney's Office announced that they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a crime had been committed. And so, with that, the investigation was placed on inactive status. And for the Greenbergs, that, of course, is another crushing, blow, but they refused to give up. That same month, Ellen's fiance broke his years-long silence and he gave his first public statement to CNN. He actually condemned what he called, quote, the pathetic and despicable attempts to desecrate my reputation and her privacy by creating a narrative that embraces lies, distortions, and falsehoods in order to avoid the truth. Mental illness is very real and has many victims, end quote. Then, on December 11th, the Greenbergs appeared in court for their lawsuit against the city. Their attorneys argued that officials mishandled the investigation into Ellen's death and were now covering up their mistakes. They also accused those involved of intentionally causing the couple emotional distress.
But defense attorneys pushed back, arguing that the claims did not meet the high legal threshold for intentional infliction of emotional distress. They also pointed out that their clients were protected by immunity. Just weeks later, on January 31st, 2025, which is just under 2 weeks ago at the time of this recording, the case took another dramatic turn. A judge ruled that the Greenbergs' lawsuit against the city could move forward to trial. Jury selection was scheduled to begin on February 3rd. The judge also ordered that medical examiners Marlon Osborne and Sam Galino, along with homicide detective John McNamee, must testify in court. And following this ruling, Marlon Osborne actually submitted a sworn statement revealing that he no longer believed Ellen's manner of death should be classified as a suicide.
Wow.
14 years later, and when court is on your back,
Right.
Do with that what you will. In his statement, Osborne cited, quote unquote, additional information that he had learned since issuing the amended death certificate. He acknowledged that the new details raised serious questions, including whether Ellen's fiance had been seen entering the apartment before calling 911 on January 26, 2011, as well as whether the door had truly been forced open as reported, which was a huge part of this story, whether it was just opened, whether it had been pushed open, what actually happened that day, as well as whether Ellen's body had been moved by someone else inside the apartment near the time of her death. And the findings of Dr. Lindsay Emery, who actually conducted a neuropathological evaluation of Ellen's cervical segment sample.
So despite his new position, though, Osborne made it clear that his conclusion was not binding on the city. And he stated, I am no longer empowered to amend Ellen's death certificate myself because I no longer maintain a Pennsylvania medical license and am no longer employed by the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office. One of the Greenbergs' attorneys, Will Trask, said that Osborne issued the statement as part of an agreement to resolve the lawsuit, and in exchange, the Greenbergs agreed to release him from the lawsuit just days before the trial was set to begin on February 3rd, which was like 1 week ago.
Right.
With Osborne no longer a defendant, only two remained, and that was the former chief medical examiner, Sam Galino, and police detective, John McNamee, and they both had denied any wrongdoing in the case. On the morning of February 3rd, jury selection was set to begin, but before the proceedings could get started, Greenberg attorney Joe Podraza made a statement to reporters, and he confirmed that the Greenbergs' second lawsuit, the one demanding that the medical examiner's office change Ellen's cause of death, had also been settled. That case had been pending before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. A spokesperson for the city of Philadelphia emphasized that while officials did not admit liability, the Greenbergs would receive a monetary settlement, and the amount of that would be disclosed at a later time. Additionally, the city's medical examiner's office agreed to re-examine Ellen's case. So after the settlement was made public, the Greenberg attorney acknowledged the toll that the past 14 years had taken on the whole family and said that they are exhausted. They spent their retirement on this case. They're ready for closure. He also said all they wanted was for Dr. Osborne to admit that he was wrong and that their daughter didn't kill herself. And that's what they got. The rest of it was just icing on the cake. Ellen's mom, Sandra, shared her own reaction with NBC Philadelphia. She said, "I hope today we made Ellen proud of us, and we were certainly very proud of her as her parents. It's monumental. For 14 years, we've been dealing with this suicidal label." Since the settlement, the Greenbergs have continued to speak with various media outlets about their fight for justice, and they also share updates in the Justice for Ellen group. So if you are someone who has been following the case, you should definitely check that out. It's active and has a lot of information going in and out of there. But yeah, wow.
This is huge. I mean, really, this is 14 years in the making, and all her parents have been asking is to please. Remember, they were fighting just to have it looked at. Like, it was just the
Yeah,
craziest thing to have to fight to say, could we get another pair of eyes on there?
right.
And that became a whole thing. It's unreal how much they've had to go through just to have any other, like, can we get all the information? Do you have all the information? And her parents have just gone through so much to be fighting 14 years later just for answers that they've deserved for this whole time. I commend them and just have so much respect for them, and I'm glad to see some things moving in this case for them.
Yeah, I feel like it's always nice to be able to share an update that for the family, this is a great turning point for them. They're able to, this is like their attorney said, this is really all they wanted. They just wanted them to take a look at this, and they got what they wanted. So you always love to hear an update like that, where they're
Right.
not going to be continuing a legal battle and having to continue to fight the courts for this purpose any longer.
Right. Absolutely. So, of course, we'll keep you guys updated if there's anything more that happens in this case. Definitely join the Facebook group. They have minute by minute stuff. I always see stuff on Twitter about this case. So it was really incredible to see this in real time coming up. So we'll have a few more of these updates over some other stories if we've had any recently that have some really substantial updates that we'll share with you guys. And thanks for listening.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.